All right, good evening everybody and welcome to session 4 of Music Theory. Today we're going to continue to talk about some concepts in harmony and harmonic analysis. And we're going to sort of finish up our unit on harmony today so that we can hopefully finish up. If we have to do a little bit next week, that's fine. Hopefully the idea then is to spend the last 2 classes on large-scale musical forms. How do we listen to an entire piece of music? Or in the very least, how do we listen to an entire movement of a piece of music? What are we looking for? What are sort of the road signs that we're looking for when we're listening to a symphony or a movement of a symphony? But as I mentioned, today we're going to be continuing our discussion of functional harmony, doing a little bit more with that. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint. Rachel, if you could enable screen share. And here we go. Okay, so last time we talked about how we get the chords that we use in a piece of music. And in a major key, we derive these chords from the major scale. We went through all of this. We have 3 chords that are going to be, we build the chords build the triads off of the notes of the major scale. When we do this, we get 3 major chords, the root, 1, and then 4 and 5. We get 3 minor chords based on 2, 3, and 6, and we get 1 diminished triad based on scale degree 7. We can also use 7th chords, the minor 7th chord built on scale degree 2. In the key of C, it's D minor 7th. The dominant 7th chord built on scale degree 5, and then the half diminished 7th chord built on scale degree 7, and as I mentioned last time, the only non-diatonic chord, the fully diminished 7th chord, also built on scale degree 7, using an accidental to lower the 7th scale degree from what you would otherwise expect. We went through all of this last week. We also talked about the chord progression flowchart. Remember, we built it off of the circle of fifths to determine the order that we're typically going to see the chords in a major key. So we can go linearly through 3, 6, 4 or 2, 7 or 5, and 1. We can also go 7 to 5, 4 to 2, 4 directly to 1 in our play goal progression, 5 back to 6 in our deceptive progression, and 3 directly to 4. We built this flowchart last week, and then we talked about cadences. Cadences are a form of musical rhetoric that we use when we get to the end of a phrase. And as I mentioned a little bit when we started to analyze Joy to the World last week, think about where you would take a breath while you're singing the song. And generally, where you would take a breath is where the phrase ends. And at the end of a phrase, you're going to generally see one of 4 types of cadences. The authentic cadence, the most common, which is where either 5 will go to 1. And as I mentioned, all of you at the symphony have heard a piece that ends something like, or something like that. We can also have 7 going to 1. A little crunchier. And we can have 1 in first inversion, moving to 5, then moving to 1, where the bass, because it's, in second inversion, where the bass is the 5th of the chord for the tonic chord. So G in the bass, then C and E. That chord moves to 5, and then from there to 1. We have the plagal cadence, the amen cadence. The deceptive cadence, 5 going back to 6. and the half cadence, any of the chords that could come before 5, the 4 chord, the 2 chord, or the 1 chord in second inversion, any of them going to 5 at the point where you would take your breath and not going to 1. So we then moved on to start analyzing a well-known piece of music, Joy to the World. And we got through the first line before we had to stop. So I already put the analysis up of the first line. This is what we did at the end of last session. We start out, first phrase on our tonic. We have a passing tone, non-chord tones here, a passing tone, going to a 4 chord, back to 1 in our plagal progression. From 1, we can go anywhere. We go to 2, and then our 1 in second inversion, our 5 with a little 7th added in, and back to 1. The second phrase is even simpler. We start from 1, go to 4, go to 5, and back to 1. So now, from there, let's move on and take a look at the second line of this piece. So I put up, we start with the 1 chord that we just finished. And I'm going to reiterate it here, our 1. Now, going on, the next 2 phrases are identical. Harmonically, not a whole lot happens in these phrases. We start from 1, like at the beginning of the first phrase. This right here is going to be a passing tone. Again, we have that C sharp. It doesn't make a functional harmony given what else is going on. So this we're going to call a passing tone. From there, we do have a chord. It's our G chord, our 4 chord in second inversion. So we will write our 4 underneath. And the very next chord is where our 1 chord returns. So you go from 4 back to 1. Little mini amen in there. From here, we're basically just going to stay on 1 until we go back up. Just like before, this set of notes here is also going to be a passing tone. It's simply used to get the melody from this D major, from this form of 1, to this form of 1. It's simply used to smooth out that transition between these 2 1 chords. The second phrase here is exactly like the first phrase. We start on 1, we're still on 1. We have our passing tone here. We have our 4 chord here. Going right back to 1. And staying on 1, but with a passing tone here. So that's our second phrase of Joy to the World. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Passing tone, 4, 1. Passing tone, still on 1. Passing tone, 4, 1. Passing tone, just like that. All right. Any questions on that phrase before we move on to phrase number 3? Okay, here we go. So, third line. Also, not too complicated. Again, the far left measure is the last measure of the previous phrase. So we're on our 1 chord and I'll play it through once. Like that. Again, not a ton is going to happen here. We just stay on one here. We have a passing tone here. Again, just getting us from one voicing of the one chord to another voicing of the one chord through a smooth passing tone. We're going to do the process in reverse here. Again, a passing tone. Just going to another voicing of the tonic chord. But at this point, the chord changes from 1 to 5. Again, when we're on 1, we can go anywhere. Very simple. We just go one step back in the flow chart, chord progression flow chart, back to 5. And we sit on 5. A little interesting thing happens at the end here. This right here, you could call that a passing tone, but it also does make our one chord and second inversion. So you could call it that as well, or you could call it a passing tone. This then allows us to add this G, which is the 7th of the chord. We go from just a 5 triad, a dominant triad, to a dominant 7th chord. Like that. So we just go from 1 to 5. 1, passing tone, 5, 5, 7. Like that. That is the third line. Any questions about the third line of Joy to the World? All right. Going on to the last and final here. So again, far left measure is the last measure of the previous phrase, just so you get an idea of where we're coming from. This, of course, is a 5/7 chord, as we mentioned. So we're here. We're going to use this sonority again as a passing sonority, but remember also you could call it a one chord in second inversion, but for now we'll call it a passing sonority to get us from one voicing of 5/7 to another. This is still our 5/7 right here. And as we expect, we return to 1 here, our D major triad. Next chord is our 4 chord, second inversion with D in the bass, our G major chord. 4 returns to 1. We have a passing tone here to get us from one voicing of 1 to another. This chord, our E minor, is our 2 chord, hasn't made an appearance since the very first line. 2, of course, a minor chord. And we finish up with our perfect authentic cadence, 1 in second inversion, 5 with an added 7th, and 1. Just like that. One more time, I'll play the last phrase from the beginning of the line. Okay, so that is Joy to the World in a nutshell. A pretty simple piece that doesn't use a whole lot of chords. We really only used 1, 4, 2, 5. That's about it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Any questions at all about what we just did with Joy to the World? Okay. Now, we're going to move on to another Christmas carol that hopefully all of you know, and this one is going to give us a little bit more meat. It is, O Come All Ye Faithful, the processional hymn at many a Christmas Eve midnight service all across the world. Beloved, beloved Christmas carol. I'll play it through once, and then we'll talk it through. Here we go. So there you go. Oh, come all ye faithful. Now, this is in the key of G major. So in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you have the diatonic triads of G major. Our one chord is going to be a G major chord. Our two chord is going to be A minor. Our three chord is B minor. Our four chord is C major. Our five chord is D major. Our six is E minor. And finally, our seventh is F sharp diminished. Like that. Flow chart, of course, is in the bottom right-hand corner for reference. And let's see what we come up with. So, we're in the key of G major. We start out, of course, as expected, with a G major triad. Pretty much all of this is good old G major for the pickup note and the first full measure. From here, this is an A minor seventh chord. Remember, we can have our two chord be a seventh chord. This is going to be A minor seventh. This is a third inversion A minor seventh chord. As you can see, the G, the seventh of the chord. In this case, the G is in the bass. 2-7 going to a 5 chord, D major. Five can go either to 1 or back to 6. In this case, it goes to its usual place, back to 1. From here, just have a nice, simple 1, 5, 1. Again, from 1 we can go anywhere. In this case, we're going to go to a C major chord, which in the key of G major is our 4 chord. 4 typically goes either directly to 1 or more commonly to 7 or 5. It can also, of course, go to 1 in second inversion, which sets up our authentic cadence. And in this case, that is what it is going to do. 1 in second inversion, leading to 5, where the D in the bass stays the same. You can see that right there, the same note in the bass. Now, this is the end of a line, the end of a phrase, after we sing joyful and triumphant. We are always going to take a breath. It's a good indication it's the end of a phrase, and at the end of that phrase, triumphant, we end on a 5 chord. So the cadence at the end of this phrase is a half cadence. Now, after we take that breath, we are on a 5 chord. Where do we go next? From a D major chord to an E minor chord. We have a nice deceptive progression here to start the second line. We have our 6 chord, our minor 6, our deceptive progression. So once again, we start on 1, 2, 7, 5, back to 1, 5, 1, 4, 1 in second inversion, 5. We breathe, and we go on a 6 chord, a deceptive progression. So, still pretty straightforward. We had a couple of new things in there, a 2-7 chord, we had a 6 chord, but by and large, still pretty straightforward. Any questions about the first line of O Come All Ye Faithful? All right. So now we're going to look at the second line, and this is where we're going to get something very, very interesting. So we start on our 6 chord, then we have an accidental. We have our C sharp here. C sharp is not a diatonic note. It's not part of the G major scale. So what is it doing in here? Now, we could call it a passing tone. Our knee-jerk might be, oh, it's just a passing tone that the altos have to sing while everybody else is still singing their part, their previous note. Maybe, except look at the chords here. We start, as I mentioned, on our 6 chord, a minor chord, E minor. The next chord after that C sharp is a D major chord. That, of course, is a 5 chord. Now, come over and look at the bottom right-hand corner at our flow chart. We started at 6 here, and we immediately went to 5 without stopping at 2 or 4. That is unusual. And that will clue us in, because it doesn't follow the flow chart, that will clue us in that this C sharp is probably not just a passing tone, that there's some reason that that C sharp is there. I'm going to get to that. For now, we're just going to put a question mark in here, and we're going to keep plugging along. So we had our 6 chord, E minor, our C sharp, the B changing from the C sharp, which is our question mark chord, going to 5. The next chord is also not a chord that you find in G major. This is an A major chord. If you recall, this C sharp will be a C sharp until we have another bar line. The bar line is here, but because we haven't had a bar line yet, this C sharp is going to still be a C sharp. It doesn't go back to being C natural yet. So all of a sudden now we have this A major chord, not a diatonic chord in the key of G major. So what is it doing in there? We'll put a question mark and we'll figure it out in a little while. The next chord after the question mark is back to 5, back to our D major chord. 5 can go to a couple places. In this case, it goes to G major, back to 1, where it would usually go. 1 can go anywhere, goes back to 5, just one click back on the flow chart. 5 goes to 1, D major, back to G major. And then we have 5 to begin the next bar. That strange A chord, and not only is it an A chord with a C sharp instead of C natural, as what we would expect, if you look in the tenor voice, it is even an A dominant 7th chord, a dominant 7 as opposed to a minor 7 on where we would typically expect a minor 7th chord. So again, this is some kind of dominant 7, so we can put a 7 here, but we are going to put a question mark once again. So we have some unanswered questions here, but this question mark chord goes back to 5. Okay. Besides the question marks, which I promise I will address, are there any questions about the second line of O Come All Ye Faithful? Okay, great. Going on to the third line. We'll play it once. So first note is first chord is what we call an incomplete chord. We only have 2 notes. We have a B and we have a D. Now, this could be a couple of things, but if you remember where we're coming from, we just had a D major chord. And now we're going here. Now, D major, usually in the key of G major, usually D major is going to go back to G, 5 going to 1. And even though we don't have a G in this chord, the B and D are the 3rd and the 5th of G, so it's sort of like a tonic chord. It's not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 1 because that is how it's going to function for us, but I'm going to put it in parentheses because we don't actually have a tonic. We don't actually have the tonic note. We don't actually have the G in there. So if we think about that, despite not having the tonic note, if we at least think about that as a tonic, we can then call this, that is going to be our 2 chord. It's an A minor triad. And then we have another note in the alto part, another note in the second line down from the top that looks like it could be a passing tone. However, if you look at the next chord, that is a tonic chord. That's our G major triad. And as we know, 2 does not go directly to 1. It generally has to pass through 5 or 7. And in this case, it doesn't. So that F sharp is going to be something important that we will deal with later. In the meantime, as we did before, we will put a question mark. But going on from the last beat of this first bar, from 1, we can go anywhere. In this case, back to 2. And in this instance, we have a 7th of the chord. So there'll be 2, 7. This 2-7, the G just moves once down to F sharp, and that creates our F sharp diminished triad, 7 diminished, which goes back to 1. It goes back to G major. From there, 1, we can go anywhere. 5, 1. One, in this case, goes to E minor, 6. Oh, I'm going to redo that. From 6 to 2, all of this very, very expected given our flow chart. From 2 to 5. And we get to the end of the line, we take a breath, we end on 5. Once again, we have a half cadence. Okay, before we go on, I made a mistake. Go back to the first bar here. This is not a question mark. We know what this is. This, our 2 chord, the F sharp simply turns it into a 7 diminished triad. That was my mistake. I apologize, but since this is going to be preserved for posterity's sake on YouTube, I figure I may as well correct it. Okay, so with that minor apology, does everything else make sense in the third line here? Okay, so going on to the fourth line, to the chorus. Chorus is actually quite simple. The chorus is simply 5 and 1 chords alternating back and forth. You have, start out with 1, 5, 1, 5, 7, 1. 1, 5, 1, 5, 7, 1. In the interest of time, I'm not going to write it all in because I want to make sure we get to everything that I want to talk about. But that's the basic idea here. The last line is a little bit more interesting, so I will go through that. Start on our 1 chord. This one here is our 5 dominant 7. The 7, that's C, is in the soprano voice. 5, 7 goes right back to 5. Sorry, 5, 7 goes right back to 1. That's what I meant to say. 1 goes back to 5. 5 here goes to this strange sonority here where we once again have a C sharp. That'll be our question mark for now. You can see that the alto voice does hold over before moving to the C sharp. That is what we call a suspension, where one voice, everything else moves, and one voice stays the same, which creates a dissonance with the bass. In this case, the bass is an E, and it's a 7th there. That seems unresolved, which is why it has to go down to that C sharp. like that. It's called a suspension. Question mark chord leads us back to 5, which then adds a 7th in the bass. Five, 7 goes to 1. One can go anywhere. 1 goes to 4. 4, we're getting to the very end of the piece here. So the cadence we're going to expect, because it's the end, is an authentic cadence. And we have a perfect, beautiful example of one with a 1 chord in second inversion, going to 5, where the bass stays the same, the D stays the same, and finally to 1. So 1 in second inversion, 5, and 1, where the D holds over from the second inversion chord to the 5 chord, this whole thing being our authentic cadence. Okay, so besides a few unanswered questions, we have taken a look at O Come All Ye Faithful, a slightly more involved piece, a slightly more involved hymn than Joy to the World. Any questions? Okay, so what about the question marks? This is the second line. We had those C sharps appearing, not diatonic. What do we do about them? I apologize that this slide has a ton of text on it, but hopefully I will be able to make some sense of it for you. The chords that have the C sharps are what we call secondary dominant chords and secondary diminished chords. These are essentially a major triad, dominant 7th chord, diminished triad, half diminished 7th chord, or fully diminished 7th chord that is used to prepare a chord other than 1. Basically, we're using this final step of the flow chart, 7 going to 1, 5 going to 1, on a key other than the tonic, basically leading to the wrong key from what we would expect given the key that we are in. Essentially, this is another tool in the toolbox for composers to travel through this flow chart, just to add a little bit more interest to the chords, because of course we have a limited number of chords, 7 diatonic chords with a few 7th chords that you can add in as well. This is just another tool for composers to move through the flow chart. Now, secondary dominants and secondary diminished chords can be used instead of a part of the flow chart or in addition to part of the flow chart. So if you remember back to the second line of O Come All Ye Faithful, we had this chord here was a 6 chord, an E minor chord, and the chord on the 3rd beat was a 5 chord, and we did not know what the chord on the 2nd beat was. That is going to be a secondary diminished chord, secondary diminished triad. You can see, if you look at the notes on the 2nd beat, we have the E and the G's that hold over from the 1st beat. We have the C sharp on the 2nd beat, C sharp, E, G. That's a C sharp diminished triad. And that is going to be used in place of either 4 or 2. That's an instance where it's used instead of one of the parts of the flow chart. Ooh. So it can also be used to prolong a harmony before moving on to another step in the flow chart. That is what happens in the second to last bar here. This is a 5 chord. We're in the key of G major. This is a 5 chord. We have another 5 chord here. And this chord, this A dominant 7th chord, that is going to be what we call a secondary dominant 7th chord that's used to prolong this 5 chord before it moves on to another step in the flowchart. The very last thing I wrote, tonicization. That is the long word that we use in music theory to describe the momentary treatment of a chord other than the tonic as the tonic. Again, when we take this part of the flowchart and we apply it to another step other than 1. All right, that was a lot of information, a lot of words on the page. Are there any questions about the basic gist of secondary dominant and secondary diminished chords?
Yeah, well, okay, so
yes,
with this is a pretty advanced, both of us know it's a pretty advanced thing in theory to think about with secondary dominant chords and secondary diminished. I think probably the most common secondary dominant is 5 of 5. And so can you explain just like briefly, how do you know, like if you're just listening to something, what is that sound that you get? Because there is a pretty specific sound, especially for 5 of 5 chords in the music, that you're like, oh, they're doing something weird here, but it's still in the key. They're just doing that weird secondary dominant thing.
Yes. Okay. So I think I will get to that next on my next page.
Perfect.
So, if at the end of this page, if it doesn't clear up the question, then please ask again, and I will definitely try to explain further. So, basic flow chart, once again on the screen. This is how the secondary dominants fit in. So, we have our actual dominant, 5 going to 1. Working backwards from that, we can have 5 of 5 or 5/7 of 5. We can have 5 of 2 or 7 diminished of 2. We can have 5 of 4 or 7 diminished of 4. 5 of 6 or 7 diminished of 6. We can even have 5 of 6 coming from 5 in our deceptive progression. We can have 5 of 3 or 7 diminished of 3. We, however, cannot have 5 of 7 or 7 of 7. You don't get this because the diminished sonority is so unstable that whatever comes before it is either going to be more unstable or at least as unstable. And it just, composers generally avoided actually going to a diminished triad in that regard. So we go through our flow chart. I'm going to start with something simple. 1, 2, 5, 1. Talked about it a lot. Now, instead of just straight up 1, 2, 5, 1, what if we did 1 going to 2, but we decided to add a 5 of 5 before we have 5. And then going to 1. Essentially, the 5 of 5 in this case, in C major, that's our tonic. 5 is G major. 2 is D minor. But 5 of 5 is going to be D major. You can really hear when 2 goes to 5 of 5. If a composer uses both 2 and 5 of 5 to set up the dominant, you can really hear that minor become major before going to the 5. In the top voice, the minor third goes to the major third, and then eventually to 5. So I'll play a slightly more involved progression that uses a few more of these. So here is 1. First of all, the basic version, no secondary dominant or diminished. 1, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. So this time we can have 1, 3, 5 of 6. Our E minor becomes E major, going to 6. And instead of going directly to 2, why don't we make it really fun and add a 7, fully diminished 7 of 2. So we could have just gone 6 to 2. But instead we go from 6, 7 fully diminished to 2. And then we could either go 2, 5, 1, or we could go 2, 5 of 5, 5, 1. So I'll play the whole progression. 1, 3, 5 of 6, 6, 7 fully diminished 7 of 2, 2, 5 of 5, 5, 1. Like that. Okay, does that make any more sense at all?
Yes, I think that does make sense. I don't know if you're going to talk about this or, but how these chords are actually built. How if you're looking at that and you see accidentals are a really good place to look to if there might be one, right? You know, that's a really good place to start.
Yeah.
But how 5 of 5 is actually, you go to the 5th and then it's the 5 of that, you know, talking about how they're actually created and that part. Are you going to talk about that at all?
Okay, so I think the next page, we're going to look again at the second line of O Come All Ye Faithful. And I think all of this stuff here is hopefully going to help clear any of that up. So
these questions are
with
just
what we
slightly
now know, it's okay. It's totally fine. I love it. I'm glad people are asking questions tonight. Okay, so now with all of that in mind, we're going to look at the second line once again. So second line, we started out, we're in G major. We started out with our 6th chord, minor 6. And then we mentioned that our 3rd chord was D major, a 5 chord. So going from 6, getting to 5, we had this funny C sharp in here. What is that doing? Okay, so this is a secondary diminished triad. I have in the bottom left-hand corner here both the diatonic chords in G and the diatonic chords in D, because this is going to be 7 diminished of 5. And in this case, 5 is D. We have 5 here. Then we go and think about, okay, what are the chords in D? This 7 diminished, C sharp, E, G, is exactly the chord we have. And almost as if we were in D, 7 diminished, that C sharp, E, G can go to D. So we're going to add in here, this is how we write it, 7 diminished of 5. We put a slash and then 5, like that. Again, as I mentioned before, that 7 diminished is used instead of the 4 or 2 step in the flow chart. 6, 7 diminished of 5, 5. Like that. Now, I mentioned the next chord here, that C sharp still carries over because we haven't had a bar line. So this is an A major chord. It's not a diatonic chord, but it is 5 in the key of D, and that is going to be our 5 of 5 right there. So similarly, we write it 5, and then the slash like a fraction almost, 5 of 5. That's how we read it, 5 of 5 when we see that. And as we expect, it goes back to 5. This is a case where the secondary dominant is used to prolong a harmony already established. We've already had 6 going to 7 diminished to 5, 5. So we've already established 5, and this 5 of 5 is simply allows us to stay around the 5 sonority before we go too much farther. Now at the end here, it's going to be a similar thing. We're already on 5 here. This, as I mentioned, is a 7th chord, A dominant 7. Again, we have it right here. A dominant 7 is going to be 5 in the key of D. It's going to be 5 of D, 5, 7 of 5. Going back to 5, simply used to prolong this 5 in a way that's a little bit more interesting than if we just sort of sat on 5 and kept going. This gives it a little bit more interest. It also allows the top voice to change in a meaningful way other than just a passing tone. So in this one line, and just this second line of O Come All Ye Faithful, we've seen 3 types of secondary chords. We've seen the secondary diminished triad. We've seen the secondary dominant triad. And we've seen the secondary dominant 7th chord. Okay, there's probably a lot. Questions? Does that clear some of the inquiries up?
I think so. A couple people have commented that they understand why music is like math.
Cool.
But no, I think that definitely helps. One question that I got is, does the secondary dominant have to always go to the chord that is on the bottom? So does a 5 of 5 always have to go to 5, or could a 5 of 5 go to something that's also in its column of the original flow chart? This
is really cool, actually. Sometimes you'll get composers that simply go around the progression chart only using the secondary dominants. They never actually finish at where they're supposed to go. So I showed the progression earlier. 1, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, with no secondary chords in it at all. I then added some secondary chords. 1, 3, 5 of 6, 6, 7 diminished of 2, going to 2, 5, 1. Now, instead of having the resolution chords, you could theoretically go something like 1, 5 of 6, 5 of 2, 5 of 5, 5, 1. You don't actually have to resolve. That's a very, very good question. So keep an eye out for that. If you see a bunch of major triads in a row, and it's like, well, in diatonically, we should have some minor triads in here. It's probably the composer just stringing a bunch of secondary dominants together. So once again, 1, 5 of 6, 5 of 2, 5 of 5, 5, and then you can either even go back again. 5, 5 of 6, 5 of 2, 2, 5. Like that. It's so much fun. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with it.
Cool. I think that's, well, so like a 5 of 2, could a 5 of 2 go to 4 since they're in the same column, or does a 5 of 2 have to go to 2?
5 of 2 is generally not going to go to 4. And it's simply weird. Because D major and F major you might hear a composer in the early 20th century do something like that, but it's not going to be a real functional harmony. They're fairly different. You have one note in common. You have the A, the 5th of D major, or the 3rd of F major. But otherwise, you got this F sharp, which clashes with the root there. It's not going to generally do that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all the questions that I've gotten so far. So.
Great, cool. Okay, so here's the deal. I definitely did not get as far as I wanted, and it's almost 7. And if I go on from here, we're getting into a whole new topic that's going to be a big chunk to chew. What do we think? Do we want to stop for today here, or if we continue, we're going to go over time a lot.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we will go over quite a bit because I know what you're thinking. So
you know what's coming next, right? I
know what's coming next. So I probably save time so we don't feel rushed to do that, and people don't feel like they can come back and watch it at another time. But yeah, this is great. I mean, this is a hard topic to cover even this is a hard topic to cover in a smaller amount of time. So
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That was really great.
There we go. We'll have to spend a little bit more time next session just doing one more major topic in harmony, and then we'll probably 20 minutes in or so we'll be able to start talking about large-scale musical forms.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being with us tonight. Maybe we'll see you next week, but we'll definitely see you in 2 weeks for the 5th one of these. And yeah, we hope you guys have a wonderful evening.